First off, my thoughts are with the young girl involved in the violent attack in our community and of her family. No child should ever have to go through something like that. Violence, humiliation, and trauma of that level is something that should unsettle all of us as a community. I also want to acknowledge that I may not have every detail of the situation right, so if I misspeak about anything involving the family or the support efforts around them, I do apologize. In moments like this, information is often incomplete, emotional, and rapidly developing, and it's important to approach it carefully rather than carelessly. I also want to be clear that I did personally reach out to offer support to the family because I truly do care about what happened to this girl. I am someone who cares deeply. I am someone who wants to help, and not just in isolated cases or selective moments. I try to support anyone I come across who is struggling, whether that's addiction, homelessness, mental health challenges, trauma, poverty, or simply going through a difficult period in life where everything feels unstable and overwhelming. That approach is not limited to one situation or one type of person. It is something that reflects how I try to engage with people in general and how I try to show up in my community and in the work I do through Project Red Deer. And that is part of why this situation has been sitting so heavily with me. Not because I think this young girl should receive less attention, care, or concern, but because I know there are many others experiencing similar violence every single day who never receive any attention at all. There are people who suffer in silence, without visibility, without recognition, and without any wider acknowledgement of what they've gone through. And in many cases, their experiences are no less severe, no less traumatic, and no less life-altering. I've seen that reality firsthand. I've seen vulnerable people in shelters being violently assaulted, often in environments where they were already struggling to survive day to day. I've seen individuals dealing with addiction who are not only battling their own internal challenges, but also being exploited, attacked, or left injured in situations where they had very little protection or support. I've seen people living rough treated as though they are disposable, spoken to, treated, and handled as if their suffering somehow carries less weight because of their circumstances. And what stands out is that most of these situations never become public. They are not shared widely. They are not turned into awareness campaigns. There are no fundraisers, no public names, no calls for justice in most cases. They simply exist, quietly, and then disappear from public attention without resolution or acknowledgement. That disconnect is difficult to ignore once you've seen enough of it. Because violence is violence. Trauma is trauma. Pain is pain. It does not change based on a person's background, social status, appearance, or whether others find them relatable or familiar. And yet attention in society often does follow those patterns. Certain cases become widely known, widely shared, and widely discussed, while others remain almost entirely invisible. That is not said as a criticism of any one individual case. It is a reflection on a broader pattern in how attention and empathy function in modern culture. And it raises uncomfortable but necessary questions about how we value human suffering and what determines whether something is seen or ignored. This is not about reducing attention from the young girl in Red Deer. She deserves care, protection, justice, and a path toward healing. That should never be in question, and nothing about reflecting on broader issues should ever take away from that. But there is a wider concern that this situation highlights, and it sits underneath many similar events that appear in communities everywhere. There is a growing sense of emotional fatigue and detachment in society when it comes to violence, suffering, and instability. People are increasingly exposed to distressing events through constant media cycles, social platforms, and rapid information sharing. Over time, repeated exposure can dull emotional response, even when individuals do not consciously intend for that to happen. What once would have been shocking for a community can become, over time, another brief moment of attention before the next event replaces it. That cycle is becoming more common, and it changes how people respond to real human suffering. Social media plays a significant role in this shift. Instead of immediate human intervention or support, there is often a tendency to document, record, and share. In some cases, the act of recording replaces the instinct to intervene or assist. Attention becomes the primary response rather than action or compassion. This does not mean individuals are uncaring. It reflects a broader environment where visibility, engagement, and reaction are constantly encouraged. Over time, that environment shapes behavior in subtle but important ways. Alongside this, there is also a growing tendency to categorize people based on simplified labels, whether related to background, lifestyle, mental health, addiction, or social status. Once those labels are applied, it becomes easier for empathy to weaken. People begin to unconsciously separate themselves from those they perceive as different, even though the underlying human experience of suffering remains the same. And that is where a deeper issue begins to form. Because once empathy becomes conditional, it stops functioning as a consistent moral response. It becomes selective, influenced by familiarity, relatability, or perceived social proximity. And when empathy becomes selective, entire groups of people can be overlooked, even when their suffering is just as real and just as severe. There are many individuals living through ongoing cycles of hardship who rarely receive attention or recognition. Their experiences are not always tied to a single moment or event that captures public awareness. Instead, their suffering is continuous, often invisible, and therefore less likely to be acknowledged in broader discussions. That does not reduce the reality of what they are going through. It only reduces visibility. And visibility often determines whether people are seen, supported, or remembered. This is part of what makes situations like the one in Red Deer emotionally complex to reflect on. It is not about comparison of suffering or ranking one experience above another. It is about recognizing that attention is not always distributed evenly, even when the underlying realities are similar. Over time, this imbalance can contribute to a sense of disconnect within communities. People may begin to feel that certain suffering is recognized while other suffering is overlooked. That perception, whether accurate in every case or not, influences trust, empathy, and collective responsibility. And when those begin to weaken, communities become more fragmented in how they respond to harm and vulnerability. At the same time, there is a broader responsibility that extends beyond individual reactions. Communities, institutions, and cultural environments all contribute in different ways to how people develop, behave, and respond to conflict or stress. When violence occurs among young people, it is rarely the result of a single factor. It is often the outcome of layered influences: home environments, school environments, peer groups, digital environments, and broader cultural messaging all interacting over time. Children today are growing up in a world that is far more connected, but also far more exposed. They are constantly surrounded by information, opinions, conflict, and social comparison. Much of this occurs long before they have the emotional maturity or stability to process it in a healthy way. That level of exposure can create confusion, emotional overload, and a lack of grounded identity. Without strong support systems, clear guidance, and consistent structure, young people can become overwhelmed by influences that pull them in multiple directions at once. At the same time, many traditional forms of structure and accountability have weakened in various environments. Whether in schools, homes, or communities, there is often uncertainty about how to balance support with discipline or understanding with correction. In some cases, this has resulted in inconsistent boundaries and unclear expectations. When structure is inconsistent, children are left to interpret rules, consequences, and social norms on their own, often relying heavily on peer influence or online environments. These influences are not always constructive, and they can shape behavior in ways that are not immediately visible but become apparent over time. There is also a growing challenge in how conflict is handled socially. Instead of resolution through communication or guidance, many interactions are amplified through digital platforms. Small incidents can become highly visible, emotionally charged, and widely discussed, sometimes without full context or understanding. This environment can increase tension rather than reduce it. It can also deepen divides between individuals or groups, especially when narratives form quickly before full information is available. None of this exists in isolation. It is the result of multiple overlapping systems: technology, culture, education, family structures, and community norms, all evolving at the same time. And while it is easy to focus on individual incidents when they occur, the underlying conditions that shape those incidents are often long-term and complex. That is why moments like the Red Deer incident become emotionally significant beyond the immediate event itself. They reflect not only what happened in one situation, but also raise questions about the conditions that allow similar situations to occur elsewhere. Understanding that does not remove personal responsibility from individuals involved in harmful actions, but it does highlight the importance of examining the environments that contribute to behavior, especially when patterns begin to repeat across different cases. Because without that broader reflection, responses tend to remain reactive rather than preventative, and the cycle continues without meaningful change. Family structure and early upbringing also play a central role in how individuals develop emotional regulation, accountability, and resilience. These foundations are not formed overnight, and they are often shaped through years of consistent guidance, correction, support, and lived example. When those foundations are stable, young people are more likely to navigate external pressures with a sense of grounding. When they are unstable or inconsistent, external influences tend to have a much stronger impact. In many modern contexts, parents and caregivers are under increasing pressure themselves. Economic strain, time limitations, mental health challenges, and social stressors all affect the ability to maintain consistent presence and structure within the home. As a result, many children are growing up in environments where support exists, but may not always be consistent or predictable. At the same time, the broader cultural approach to discipline and correction has shifted in many places. There's often hesitation around setting firm boundaries, enforcing consequences, or engaging in difficult but necessary conversations with children and young people. While this shift is sometimes driven by a desire to avoid harm or promote understanding, it can also lead to uncertainty about how guidance is actually meant to be provided. Without clear boundaries, children may struggle to understand limits, expectations, and consequences. This does not mean structure must be harsh or punitive. It means structure must be clear, consistent, and grounded in care. When that structure is absent or unclear, young people often seek it elsewhere. Increasingly, that elsewhere is found in peer groups, online communities, and digital platforms that are not designed to provide long-term emotional development or stability. These environments can influence identity, behavior, and emotional responses in ways that are not always visible in the short term. Over time, however, they can contribute to confusion, instability, and difficulty managing conflict or emotional stress. This is not about assigning blame to any single group or system. It is about recognizing that development is shaped by multiple overlapping influences, and when several of those influences are unstable at the same time, the overall effect can be significant. There's also a growing cultural emphasis on immediacy, immediate reaction, immediate validation, immediate response. While this is a natural outcome of digital communication, it can reduce space for reflection, patience, and deeper understanding. In emotionally charged situations, that lack of pause can intensify conflict rather than allow it to settle or be resolved constructively. Within this broader context, incidents of violence or harm among youth cannot be viewed in isolation from the environments in which they occur. They are often reflective of accumulated pressures rather than single moments of decision alone. That does not remove responsibility from individuals for their actions. Accountability remains essential. But understanding the broader influences involved is equally important if the goal is to reduce harm over time, rather than simply respond to it after the fact. When communities lose clarity around structure, guidance, and shared expectations, young people are left navigating complex emotional and social landscapes without consistent reference points. That gap is often filled by whatever influence is most accessible, most engaging, or most immediate. And in many cases, those influences are not designed to encourage stability, reflection, or long-term well-being. As these influences accumulate, the development of emotional resilience becomes more difficult. Resilience is not something that appears automatically. It is usually formed through experience, guidance, and the presence of stable relationships that help a person process difficulty without becoming overwhelmed by it. When those supports are inconsistent, individuals may struggle more deeply with conflict, rejection, stress, or emotional pressure. This can lead to responses that are reactive rather than reflective, especially in situations where emotions escalate quickly. In a broader sense, Many communities are experiencing a gradual weakening of shared frameworks that once helped guide behavior and expectations. These frameworks included family guidance, community involvement, educational structure, and informal social accountability. While none of these systems were ever perfect, they did provide a more consistent structure for development and behavior than what is often present today. Now, responsibility is more distributed, but also more fragmented. Schools, parents, peers, and digital environments all contribute, but the alignment between them is not always clear or coordinated. This can result in mixed messages about behavior, accountability, and emotional regulation. At the same time, exposure to conflict and distress has become more frequent and more immediate. Through constant access to digital media, individuals are exposed not only to local events, but to global events, personal conflicts, and emotionally intense content on a regular basis. This level of exposure can affect perception, increasing either desensitization or emotional overwhelm, depending on the individual. Both responses, numbness and overwhelm, can reduce the ability to engage with situations in a balanced way. In either case, the capacity for steady, grounded response can be weakened over time. Within this environment, incidents involving violence or harm among young people can sometimes appear sudden, but they are often the result of long-term accumulation of emotional, social, and environmental pressures. These pressures may not always be visible on the surface, but they build gradually through repeated experiences, influences, and interactions. This is why isolated explanations are often insufficient. It is rarely one cause that leads to a harmful outcome, but rather a combination of factors interacting over time. At the same time, it is important to maintain clarity that understanding these influences does not eliminate accountability. Responsibility for actions remains with individuals. However, if the goal is prevention, then understanding context becomes essential. Without that understanding, responses tend to focus only on reaction after harm has already occurred, rather than addressing the conditions that contribute to it in the first place. This is where communities face an ongoing challenge. There is a need to balance accountability with prevention and immediate response with long-term reflection. Both are necessary, but they are not always given equal attention. When attention is focused only on the visible outcome of violence, the underlying conditions often remain unaddressed. When those conditions remain unaddressed, similar outcomes are more likely to repeat in different forms. This cycle is what makes reflection on these situations important beyond the individual event itself. It is not only about what happened in one case, but about what continues to happen in many places under similar conditions. In many ways, what emerges from all of this is a broader question about how communities understand responsibility, connection, and shared humanity. When these concepts are strong, there is a natural tendency toward care, intervention, and collective support. When they weaken, responses become more fragmented and inconsistent. A key part of this is how people perceive one another in moments of crisis or harm. When someone is seen primarily through labels, circumstances, or assumptions, it becomes easier to detach emotionally from their experience. When someone is seen first as a human being, the instinct is more likely to shift toward concern and protection. That distinction has significant consequences for how communities respond to suffering. It influences whether people step in, speak out, or disengage. It also influences how long attention is sustained once an incident is no longer actively visible in public discourse. Over time, repeated exposure to distressing events without meaningful resolution can create a cycle where attention spikes briefly and then fades. The underlying issues, however, remain present long after public focus moves on. This creates a gap between awareness and sustained engagement, which can limit long-term change. There is also a broader cultural tension between visibility and depth. Modern communication systems often prioritize what is immediate, emotionally striking, or widely shareable. While this can increase awareness in some cases, it can also reduce complex situations into simplified narratives that do not fully reflect the depth of what people are experiencing. When complexity is reduced, understanding can become incomplete. And when understanding is incomplete, responses may not fully address the underlying reality of the situation. Within this context, it becomes important to consider not only how people respond to individual events, but also how they sustain attention toward ongoing conditions that do not always present themselves in dramatic or visible ways. Many forms of suffering exist in quieter, less visible spaces. They do not always generate public attention, but they are no less significant in their impact on individuals and families. These experiences often continue without recognition, which can deepen feelings of isolation for those affected. A balanced response to these realities requires both immediate compassion and long-term awareness. It requires the ability to respond to visible events while also maintaining concern for the less visible, ongoing struggles that exist in parallel. This balance is difficult to maintain in environments that move quickly and prioritize constant information flow. However, it remains important if the goal is to build stronger, more supportive communities over time. Ultimately, the central issue is not only about individual events, but about the conditions that shape how people see one another, respond to suffering, and understand responsibility within a shared social environment. When those conditions support empathy, structure, and accountability together, communities are more likely to respond in ways that reduce harm and support recovery. When those conditions weaken or become inconsistent, the response becomes more reactive, fragmented, and short-lived. This is the broader reflection that emerges from situations like the one in Red Deer. It is not confined to a single moment or a single outcome, but extends into how communities understand and respond to human vulnerability more generally. Another layer that sits within this is the way modern environments shape attention itself. Attention has become one of the most distributed and contested aspects of daily life, constantly pulled in multiple directions by notifications, updates, commentary, and rapid shifts in information. When attention is fragmented, it becomes harder for individuals and communities to remain fully present with any single issue for a sustained period of time. This affects not only how people consume information, but also how they emotionally process it. Situations that require reflection and depth can instead be experienced in short bursts, followed by distraction or transition to something else. This does not necessarily indicate a lack of care, but it does influence the depth and duration of engagement. Over time, that can shape how seriously situations are held in collective awareness once they are no longer actively trending or visible. In contrast, meaningful engagement with complex issues often requires sustained focus, patience, and the willingness to sit with discomfort or uncertainty. These qualities are increasingly difficult to maintain in fast-moving digital environments, where content is designed to be quickly consumed and replaced. As a result, there is often a gap between awareness and sustained understanding. Many people may be aware of an issue in a general sense, but fewer may remain engaged long enough to fully understand its underlying patterns or long-term implications. This gap is significant because it influences how communities respond not just emotionally, but structurally. Awareness without sustained engagement can lead to short-lived responses rather than long-term change. At the same time, individuals are also navigating increasing emotional input from multiple sources. Personal experiences, community events, and global information streams all overlap, creating a constant background of emotional and cognitive load. Without adequate grounding, this can contribute to fatigue, detachment, or emotional overload. These conditions can make it more difficult to maintain consistent empathy, especially when faced with repeated exposure to distressing or complex situations. Over time, individuals may unconsciously begin to limit emotional engagement as a way of managing internal capacity. This again reinforces the importance of stable environments, grounding relationships, and clear frameworks that help individuals process information in a healthy and sustainable way. Without these supports, it becomes more difficult to maintain balance between awareness and emotional well-being. Within this broader context, incidents of violence or harm are not only individual events, but also reflections of the environments in which people are developing and interacting. These environments shape perception, behavior, and emotional response over time. Understanding this does not reduce accountability for actions. Rather, it adds another dimension to how communities can think about prevention, support, and long-term stability. Because without attention to these broader conditions, responses remain focused primarily on outcomes rather than causes, and the cycle of reaction continues without deeper structural change. When looking at all of these layers together, what becomes clear is that no single factor is responsible for the kinds of outcomes communities are witnessing. Instead, it is the interaction between multiple pressures, social, emotional, environmental, and cultural, that gradually shape both individual behavior and collective response. Within that complexity, it is easy to focus only on the most visible moments. Events that involve violence or harm naturally draw attention because they are immediate, emotional, and difficult to ignore. However, the conditions that contribute to those moments are often long-standing and less visible. This creates a challenge for how communities process and respond to harm. The immediate event demands attention, while the underlying conditions require reflection and patience. Balancing these two responses is not always straightforward, especially in environments where attention moves quickly and continuously shifts. In many cases, responses tend to prioritize immediacy. There is a surge of attention, discussion, and emotional reaction, followed by a gradual decline as public focus moves elsewhere. Meanwhile, the underlying conditions that contributed to the situation remain largely unchanged. This pattern can repeat across different contexts, creating a cycle where similar outcomes continue to emerge over time. Without deeper engagement with root causes, responses remain largely reactive rather than preventative. At the same time, it is important to recognize that individuals are not operating in isolation from their environments. Behavior, decision-making, and emotional responses are shaped by accumulated experiences and the conditions in which people develop. This includes family environments, educational systems, peer influence, and broader cultural messaging. None of these factors act independently. They overlap, reinforce, or sometimes contradict each other, creating complex developmental pathways that differ significantly from person to person. This complexity makes it difficult to reduce outcomes to simple explanations. Because of this, meaningful reflection requires moving beyond immediate interpretations and considering how various influences interact over time. This does not replace accountability, but it does expand understanding. Communities that are able to hold both accountability and context tend to be better positioned to address underlying issues in a constructive way. They can respond to immediate harm while also considering how to reduce the likelihood of recurrence through broader support systems and cultural awareness. However, this balance is not always maintained. In many cases, attention is drawn primarily to the visible outcome, while the underlying contributors receive less sustained focus. Over time, this can limit the effectiveness of responses. The situation in Red Deer, like many others, becomes part of this broader pattern. It reflects not only an individual incident, but also the wider conditions in which such incidents can occur. It also highlights how communities engage with suffering, attention, and responsibility in an interconnected environment. Understanding this does not provide simple answers, but it does offer a clearer view of the complexity involved. And within that complexity lies the challenge of how to build environments that support both accountability and long-term stability. Another important aspect to consider is how responsibility is understood and distributed across a community. In practice, responsibility is rarely held in one place. It exists across families, institutions, peers, and broader cultural systems, each contributing in different ways to the formation of behavior, values, and emotional development. When these systems are aligned, they tend to reinforce consistency. Expectations are clearer, guidance is more stable, and individuals are more likely to receive coherent messages about behavior and accountability. When they are misaligned or fragmented, individuals may receive conflicting messages, which can create confusion or instability over time. This does not mean that confusion automatically leads to harmful outcomes. Human behavior is not determined by any single factor. However, inconsistent environments can increase vulnerability to stress, misinterpretation, and reactive decision-making, particularly in emotionally charged situations. Within this context, it becomes easier to understand how layered influences can accumulate without being immediately visible. Many of the conditions that shape behavior develop gradually and are not always recognized in real time. By the time they become visible through an external event, they often represent the culmination of longer-term processes. This is one of the reasons why responses to harm often feel urgent but also incomplete. The visible moment is addressed, but the extended background that contributed to it is more difficult to fully engage with in the same moment. There is also the reality that modern communication systems tend to prioritize immediacy. Information is shared quickly, reactions form rapidly, and public attention shifts in short cycles. While this allows for rapid awareness, it can also limit sustained engagement with complexity. As a result, many issues enter public consciousness in intense but brief waves. They are widely discussed for a short period of time and then gradually replaced by other topics. The underlying conditions, however, remain present beyond those attention cycles. This creates an imbalance between emotional response and long-term engagement. The emotional response is often strong but temporary, while the long-term engagement required for structural change is less consistent. Bridging this gap requires intentional effort. It requires slowing down interpretation, maintaining focus beyond initial reactions, and continuing to engage with issues even after immediate attention fades. Without this, cycles of reaction and forgetfulness can repeat. Within this broader pattern, it becomes important to consider how communities define meaningful change. Change is not only measured in immediate responses or visible actions, but also in sustained shifts in understanding, behavior, and support structures over time. That kind of change is slower and less visible, but often more significant in the long term. It involves not only responding to individual events, but also adjusting the conditions that shape how similar events are prevented in the future. The reflection prompted by incident extends beyond the event itself. It becomes part of a wider consideration of how attention, responsibility, and understanding function within a complex and interconnected social environment. When all of these threads are brought together, what remains is a recognition that communities are constantly shaping and reshaping the conditions in which people live, grow, and respond to one another. These conditions are not fixed. They evolve over time through collective behavior, shared norms, institutional structures, and cultural expectations. In that sense, every community is both a product of what has come before and a contributor to what comes next. The way people respond to harm, the way they engage with vulnerability, and the way they understand accountability all play a role in shaping future outcomes. This is why reflection matters beyond any single incident. Events that draw attention often act as points of focus, but they also reveal underlying dynamics that are already present. The visible moment is only part of a longer and more complex continuum. Within that continuum, there is a persistent tension between urgency and depth. Urgency demands immediate response, clarity, and action. Depth requires patience, reflection, and sustained attention. Both are necessary, but they are not always balanced in practice. When urgency dominates without depth, responses may be fast but incomplete. When depth exists without urgency, awareness may not translate into timely action. The challenge is finding a way for both to coexist in a meaningful way. Another important dimension is the way people interpret responsibility in collective contexts. It is easy to locate responsibility in isolated individuals or specific events, particularly when those events are visible and emotionally impactful. However, broader conditions often involve multiple contributors over extended periods of time. This does not dilute accountability. Rather, it situates accountability within a wider framework of understanding. Individuals remain responsible for their actions, while also existing within environments that influence perception, behavior, and decision-making. Recognizing this dual reality is essential for any meaningful approach to prevention. Without it, responses risk focusing only on outcomes, rather than addressing the conditions that allow similar outcomes to emerge repeatedly. At a cultural level, this raises questions about what is being reinforced over time. Values are not only expressed through explicit statements, but also through patterns of attention, reaction, and prioritization. What is consistently acknowledged, ignored, or amplified contributes to shaping collective norms. If attention consistently shifts without sustained engagement, or if empathy is activated selectively rather than consistently, those patterns become part of the broader environment in which future behavior develops. This is why the reflection surrounding the Red Deer incident extends beyond the event itself. It becomes part of a larger consideration of how communities maintain empathy, structure, and responsibility in a rapidly changing social landscape. The challenge moving forward is not only to respond to individual moments of harm, but to also strengthen the underlying conditions that shape how such moments are less likely to occur, and how communities can respond in ways that are both compassionate and effective. That ongoing balance between immediate response and long-term reflection is where much of the work of a community ultimately resides. At the center of all of this remains the question of how people see one another. The way individuals are perceived, whether as fully complex human beings or as simplified categories, has a direct influence on how compassion, accountability, and engagement are expressed in practice. When perception becomes narrowed, it becomes easier to overlook the depth of someone's lived experience. When perception remains broad and humanizing, it becomes more difficult to disengage from the reality of another person's suffering. This difference shapes not only individual reactions, but also collective patterns of response. Over time, repeated exposure to fragmented or rapid information can encourage simplified interpretations of complex situations. This is not necessarily intentional, but it can become habitual. Once established, those habits influence how quickly empathy is activated and how long it is sustained. In contrast, sustained empathy requires effort. It requires the ability to hold complexity without reducing it prematurely. It requires resisting the pressure to form immediate conclusions in situations that may not be fully understood. These are not easy conditions to maintain in environments where information moves quickly and attention is constantly redirected. At the same time, communities continue to face real and immediate instances of harm that require response. The presence of complexity does not remove the need for action. Instead, it highlights the importance of grounding action in both awareness and understanding. When action is guided only by immediate reaction, it may lack depth. When understanding exists without action, it may lack impact. The integration of both is what allows responses to be both meaningful and effective. Within this broader framework, incidents like the one in Red Deer become part of a larger reflection on how society responds to vulnerability, harm, and human dignity. They are not isolated from the conditions that surround them, nor from the cultural patterns that influence perception and behavior over time. The continued challenge is maintaining awareness of both the individual and the system simultaneously, recognizing the humanity of those directly affected while also engaging with the broader conditions that shape similar events elsewhere. This dual awareness does not simplify the situation, but it does provide a more complete foundation for reflection and, where possible, meaningful change. Ultimately, what emerges from all of this reflection is not a single conclusion, but a continued responsibility to remain aware of how human behavior, social systems, and cultural environments interact over time. These interactions are complex, and they rarely produce simple or immediate explanations. What is clear, however, is that communities are constantly influencing the conditions in which future events will occur. Through patterns of attention, response, neglect, and engagement, certain dynamics are reinforced while others are weakened. This ongoing process shapes not only how individual situations unfold, but also how similar situations are understood and addressed in the future. The challenge is that many of these influences operate gradually and are not always visible in isolation. They accumulate over time, often without drawing attention until a specific event brings them into focus. By then, the conditions have already been forming for a considerable period. This is why reflection cannot remain limited to moments of crisis alone. While individual events naturally draw focus, the broader environment that surrounds them continues to exist before and after those moments. Without sustained attention to that broader environment, responses risk remaining reactive rather than transformative. At the same time, it is important to recognize that reflection is not a substitute for action. Awareness alone does not resolve harm or prevent it from occurring. Instead, it provides a foundation upon which more informed, balanced, and effective responses can be built. Within that balance lies the ongoing responsibility of communities to respond to immediate harm with care and accountability, while also engaging with the longer-term conditions that contribute to recurring patterns of vulnerability and violence. This dual responsibility is not simple to carry, and it cannot be fully resolved in a single moment or response. It requires ongoing engagement, continued reflection, and a willingness to remain present with complexity even when it is uncomfortable or difficult to hold. In that sense, the conversation prompted by incidents like the one in Red Deer extends beyond any single event or outcome. It becomes part of a wider and ongoing consideration of how people live together, respond to one another, and shape the environments in which future generations will develop. And it is within that ongoing process that the potential for meaningful change exists, not through isolated reaction, but through sustained awareness, responsibility, and collective effort over time. At the heart of everything reflected on here is a simple but difficult truth. Human beings are deeply interconnected, and the condition of one part of a community eventually affects the whole. Whether through visible events or quiet, ongoing struggles, the realities people face do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by environments, relationships, systems, and the broader culture in which they exist. The incident in Red Deer stands as a moment that draws attention to this reality, but it is not the beginning of it, nor is it the end. It is part of a much longer pattern of human experience, one that includes both harm and compassion, both neglect and care, both breakdown and the potential for repair. What matters most moving forward is not only how moments like this are responded to in the immediate sense, but what they lead people to recognize about the world around them. If reflection ends at emotional reaction, then little changes. If reflection leads to deeper awareness, then there is at least the possibility of growth. There is a responsibility that exists at every level: individual, family, community, and cultural. No single level carries the entire burden, but each contributes to the overall environment in which people develop and act. When those levels work in alignment, they can reinforce stability, empathy, and accountability. When they drift apart, fragmentation becomes more likely. This is why sustained attention matters. Not just attention to the moment of crisis, but attention to what continues afterward. The conditions that shape behavior do not disappear when public focus moves on. They remain, and they continue to influence outcomes in ways that are not always immediately visible. At the same time, compassion remains central. Without compassion, reflection becomes detached. Without reflection, compassion becomes reactive. Both are needed together if there is to be any meaningful progress toward healthier communities. There is also a need for humility in understanding these issues. No single perspective holds all the answers, and no single interpretation can fully account for the complexity of human behavior. But acknowledging complexity does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means approaching it with greater care and awareness. If anything, situations like this should serve as reminders of what is at stake when empathy weakens, when structure becomes inconsistent, or when people begin to feel disconnected from one another. These are not abstract concerns. They shape real lives in real and lasting ways. The hope, then, is not rooted in denial of difficulty, but in the possibility that awareness can lead to better choices, individually and collectively. That communities can become more attentive. That systems can become more responsive. That individuals can become more willing to see others not as categories, but as human beings with inherent value. In the end, what remains essential is the commitment to not look away from suffering, whether it is visible or hidden, whether it is widely acknowledged or quietly endured. Because the measure of a community is not only how it responds to the most visible moments, but how it holds awareness of human dignity in all circumstances. And if there is any lasting message within all of this reflection, it is that change, real, meaningful change, does not come from isolated moments of attention, but from sustained awareness, responsibility, and care carried forward over time. As we close today, I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to listen, to reflect, and to open your hearts to God's Word. In a world filled with noise and distraction, your willingness to seek truth and draw nearer to the Lord is a beautiful thing. May you leave here encouraged, strengthened, and reminded that God walks beside you in every season of life. No burden is too heavy for Him, no prayer goes unheard, and no soul is beyond His love and grace. Thank you for sharing this time together in faith. May the peace of Christ guard your hearts, may His wisdom guide your steps, and may His blessings rest upon you and your families throughout the week ahead. God bless you, and thank you for listening.